Stop waiting for people to move alone until you master yourself. You keep waiting. Waiting for the support that was supposed to come from the people closest to you. Waiting for the moment when someone finally understands what you are trying to build, what you are trying to become, what you are asking for when you reach out. Waiting for the right conditions, the right time, the right person, the right alignment of circumstances that will finally make the forward movement feel safe enough to attempt. But here is what most people never fully confront. What if that moment of support, that arrival of the right people, that perfect alignment of understanding, what if none of it comes on the schedule you have been waiting for? What if the reason you feel stuck right now, genuinely stuck, not just slow, but stopped, is not because the conditions are wrong, but because you have made your movement conditional on something that has not arrived and may not arrive in the form you expect? This audiobook is not about becoming alone. That distinction matters, and it will be developed carefully throughout what follows. Being alone and becoming self-sufficient are not the same thing. One is a state of circumstance. The other is a quality of character. What this audiobook is about is the second one, the specific development of the internal strength, the self-trust, the psychological independence, and the disciplined action that allow you to move forward in your life without requiring the support, the validation, or the presence of others before you will begin. Because here is the truth, that the waiting is costing you. The strongest version of who you can become is not built through the accumulation of external support. It is built through the consistent exercise of the capacity to act, to decide, to endure, and to build even when no one is there to witness it, affirm it, or participate in it. 12 chapters, each one a specific layer of the development, from the waiting-dependent person to the self-moving one. By the end of this audiobook, your relationship to independence, to solitude, to self-trust, to the absence of external validation will be permanently and specifically different. Not because independence will feel comfortable immediately, but because you will understand what it is actually built from. Why the waiting was costing you more than the moving alone ever could, and how the specific practices of this audiobook change who you are in the conditions that most consistently reveal that. Introduction. Why waiting is quietly destroying your life. Waiting feels safe, but it slowly keeps you in the same place. The specific quality of the waiting that this audiobook addresses is the way it conceals its cost. The waiting does not feel like destruction. It feels like patience. It feels like prudence. It feels like the reasonable response to the genuine difficulty of moving forward without the support or the clarity that the forward movement seems to require. The person who is waiting rarely understands themselves as avoiding. They understand themselves as preparing for the moment when the conditions will be right, when the people will show up, when the support will materialize, and the movement will be possible without the risk that the current absence of those things seems to create. Why people wait for others is not a simple question, and the dismissive answer that waiting is weakness, that the person who waits lacks the courage to move, misses the specific psychological mechanisms that make the waiting pattern so persistent and so difficult to interrupt. The waiting is not primarily about cowardice. It is primarily about the specific way the human cognitive and social systems process risk and uncertainty. The social brain evolved in environments where the presence of others genuinely reduced the risk of the forward movement. The group provided the resources, the protection, and the shared knowledge that made the individual venture less dangerous. The instinct to wait for the group before moving is not a psychological defect. It is the expression of a social intelligence that was specifically calibrated to the conditions in which the waiting genuinely improved the odds. The problem is the application of that calibration to modern environments where the waiting for the group before moving is not the risk reduction it was designed to be. In many of the most important movements of your life, waiting for others does not reduce the risk. It eliminates the opportunity. The illusion of the right moment is the specific cognitive pattern that the waiting produces when it extends long enough to require the justification that keeps it feeling like prudence rather than avoidance. The right moment has specific features in the waiting person's mind. The support is in place. The uncertainty is reduced. The risk is managed. The path is clearer. Each of these features is the description of the condition that will never fully exist for any genuinely important forward movement. The genuinely important movements are by definition the ones that require the movement before the conditions are fully secured, because the fully secured conditions are the product of the movement, not the prerequisite for it. Emotional dependence on support is the third specific mechanism of the waiting pattern. The person who has come to require the external support before they will act has made their action contingent on the emotional regulation that the support provides. The support reduces the anxiety of the forward movement. Without the support, the anxiety of the forward movement is not managed, and the movement does not occur. The emotional dependence is not a character flaw. It is the product of the absence of the developed internal regulation capacity that would allow the anxiety to be present alongside the movement rather than preventing it. The development of that capacity is the specific project of this audiobook. How waiting becomes a habit is the mechanism that makes the waiting pattern most resistant to change. Each instance of the waiting that is followed by the arrival of some support, some clarity, or some improvement in the conditions reinforces the waiting as the behavior that produces the desired outcomes. The reinforcement is partial and inconsistent. Sometimes the waiting produces the arrival. Sometimes it does not, but even partial, inconsistent reinforcement is among the most powerful reinforcement schedules available for the maintenance of a behavioral pattern. The person who has waited many times and occasionally received the support they were waiting for has a deeply reinforced waiting pattern that the intermittent failures of the support to arrive have not been sufficient to extinguish. The hidden cost of the delay is the cost that accumulates invisibly in the time that the waiting consumes. The skills that were not built during the waiting period. The confidence that was not developed through the action that the waiting deferred. The self-knowledge that was not acquired through the direct engagement with the challenge that the waiting postponed. The relationships that were not formed through the independent movement that the waiting prevented. These costs are genuinely hidden. They are the things that would have existed if the movement had been made. And the absence of things that do not yet exist is the hardest cost to see clearly. The introduction has named the problem with the precision it requires. The 12 chapters that follow develop the specific response to each element of the problem, the specific understanding, the specific practices, and the specific identity development that transforms the person who waits into the person who moves. Chapter 1. The Trap of Waiting for People. Every time you wait for someone else, you delay your own life. The trap is not visible from inside it. This is the specific quality that makes the waiting for palpable pattern so effective as a trap. The person who is inside it does not experience the trap as a trap. They experience it as a reasonable response to the genuine difficulty of moving forward without the support they are waiting for. They experience it as sensitivity to relationships, as the appropriate recognition that important things are done better with others, as the practical management of the genuine complexity of acting in the absence of the clarity that the other people's presence would provide. The trap is the specific mechanism through which the waiting is maintained by the very features of the situation that make the movement most necessary. The forward movement feels risky without the support. The risk feeling produces the waiting. The waiting produces the absence of the movement. The absence of the movement produces the absence of the growth that the movement would have generated. The absence of the growth produces the absence of the confidence that would have made the next movement feel less risky. And the cycle continues, each iteration reinforcing the sense that the movement without support is genuinely more dangerous than the waiting for it. Waiting for validation is the first specific form of the trap, and it is the form that most directly targets the self-inept. Validation is the specific social signal that what you are, what you have done, and what you are attempting to do is worthy of the positive regard of the people whose opinion you have made significant. The person who requires validation before moving has made their sense of the worthiness of their direction contingent on the external signal rather than the internal assessment. This contingency is the trap. The external signal is not always available, not always accurate, and not always aligned with the genuine requirements of the direction that the person's actual development needs them to move in. The specific cost of the validation dependency is the specific distortion it introduces into the decision-making process. The direction that receives the validation is the direction you move in regardless of whether it is the direction your genuine development requires. The direction that does not receive the validation is the direction you abandon regardless of whether it is the direction that the honest internal assessment would have confirmed as right. The validator's opinion has replaced your own assessment as the governing criterion of direction. And the validator, however well-intentioned, does not know what you know about yourself, your genuine needs, and the specific requirements of your development. Waiting for support is the second form of the trap, and it is the form that most directly targets the action capacity. Support in this context is the practical presence of others who share the effort, the risk, and the burden of the forward movement. The person who waits for support before acting has made their action contingent on the presence of co-participants. When the co-participants do not arrive, the action does not occur. The movement that was dependent on the support remains undone while the waiting for the support continues. The specific reality that the waiting for support pattern misunderstands is the relationship between the support and the movement. In the waiting person's model, the support precedes the movement. The support arrives. The movement becomes possible. The movement is made. In the actual experience of the people who have built significant things, the sequence is frequently reversed. The movement is made. The competence demonstrated through the movement attracts the people who provide the support, and the support arrives after the movement has already established the direction and the momentum. Waiting for the support before making the movement is waiting for the consequence before producing the cause. Waiting for approval is the third form, and it is the form that most directly targets the relationship between your behavior and others' comfort. Approval is the specific social signal that your direction, your choices, and your actions are acceptable to the people whose disapproval you have made significant. The person who waits for approval before moving has made their movement contingent on the absence of others' discomfort with the movement. This is the most specific version of the trap because the movement that matters most is almost always the movement that produces some discomfort in some of the people around you, the movement that changes the dynamic, that challenges the established arrangement, that declares a new direction that the existing relationships were not built around. Why people never show up the way you expect is the specific psychological reality that the waiting pattern consistently encounters but consistently fails to learn from. The person whose support you are waiting for has their own life, their own priorities, their own limited attention and limited energy. The support you require from them may not be the support they are capable of providing, may not arrive at the time you need it, may not take the form that would actually serve your development, and may not be sustained across the duration that your forward movement requires. This is not a betrayal. It is the normal limitation of other people's capacity to serve as the foundation for your forward movement. The truth, and it is a truth that requires the patience to sit with rather than the dramatic statement to react to, is that no one is coming to save you from the necessity of moving. The saving that you have been waiting for, in whatever form it takes in your specific situation, the rescue from the stuck place, the provision of the support that makes the movement feel safe, the arrival of the person who finally understands and makes the forward movement a shared effort, is not the model through which the genuine development of the self-moving person occurs. The self-moving person develops precisely through the accumulation of the experiences of moving without the saving. Each movement that was made without the support, each direction that was chosen without the validation, each action that was taken without the approval, is the specific training session that builds the internal architecture that no arriving support could have built. Chapter 2. Why you feel stuck without others. You were never taught how to move alone. The feeling of being stuck without others is not the accurate perception of a genuine incapacity. It is the accurate perception of the absence of a developed skill, the skill of the independent movement that the specific conditions of most people's development did not provide the opportunity to build. The distinction matters enormously because the diagnosis of a genuine incapacity produces the response of resignation, while the diagnosis of the absence of a developed skill produces the response of deliberate development. You are not stuck because you cannot move alone. You are stuck because you were not taught how. Fear of isolation is the first specific mechanism of the stuck feeling. Isolation activates the threat detection system in a way that is neurologically genuine. The social brain processes the prolonged absence of social connection as a genuine threat, producing the anxiety, the hypervigilance, and the behavioral pressure towards social recognition that physical threats produce in the system designed to manage physical safety. The fear of isolation is not irrational. It is the expression of a genuine neurological architecture that was designed for environments in which isolation was genuinely dangerous. The specific practice that the fear of isolation requires is not the suppression of the fear. The fear will continue to be present as the internal state of the person who is moving alone, particularly in the early stages of the development before the accumulated evidence of the capacity for independent movement has been built. The practice is the specific maintenance of the forward movement alongside the fear, the tolerance of the fear as the condition of the movement rather than the resolution of the fear as the prerequisite for it. This is not the trivial instruction to simply be braver. It is the specific practice of the simultaneous experience of the fear and the action, repeated across many instances, that builds the specific self-knowledge that the fear and the movement can coexist. Social conditioning is the second mechanism of the stuck feeling. From the earliest experiences of development, the social environment provides the specific training that makes the presence of others the expected condition of the forward movement. The child who moves forward without the parent present and finds the experience frightening learns the association between the absence of the other and the experience of danger. The adolescent whose social group provides the definition of the acceptable direction learns the association between the independence from the group and the experience of exclusion. The adult who has built their life around the shared direction of a relationship or an organization learns the association between the independence from those structures and the experience of loss. Each of these associations is the legitimate learning from a genuine experience. The social conditioning is not the product of a malevolent system designed to produce dependence. It is the product of the genuine human experience of the genuinely social life, the accumulated learning that the presence of others provides the safety, the orientation, and the meaning that the solitary movement does not naturally supply. The unlearning of the conditioning is not the repudiation of the value of connection. It is the specific development of the additional capacity, the capacity for the independent movement that the conditioning did not provide the opportunity to build. The need for reassurance is the third mechanism, and it is the one that most directly produces the experience of the stuck feeling in the immediate social situations that require the decision without the prior confirmation. Reassurance is the specific social signal that the direction you are about to move in is safe, that the risk is not as high as the anxiety suggests, that the outcome will be manageable, that the people around you support the direction and are available to help if the movement produces difficulty. The need for reassurance, when it is acute, produces the specific pattern of seeking the confirmation before the movement rather than building the internal assessment that would make the confirmation less necessary. The development of the internal assessment capacity is the specific alternative to the reassurance-seeking pattern. The internal assessment is the deliberate, honest evaluation of the genuine risk of the proposed movement, the genuine evidence for and against the direction, the genuine assessment of the capacity to manage the outcomes that the movement might produce. This assessment is not always comfortable. It requires the willingness to engage honestly with the genuine risks and the genuine uncertainties that the reassurance-seeking pattern was designed to manage through the comfort of the external confirmation. But the internal assessment builds the capacity that the reassurance-seeking cannot, the specific self-knowledge that the assessment was done, the direction was chosen, and the movement was made on the basis of the honest internal evaluation. Why solitude feels uncomfortable is the final mechanism to examine in this chapter, and it is the mechanism that most directly produces the specific quality of the stuck feeling that brings most people to this audiobook. Solitude is uncomfortable not because there is something wrong with you, but because the discomfort is the accurate perception of the absence of the social inputs that your cognitive and emotional system has been calibrated to use. The social inputs, the feedback, the orientation, the shared meaning, the emotional regulation that others provide, or genuine resources. Their absence is genuinely noticed by the system that was built to use them. The discomfort is not the pathology to be cured. It is the signal of the genuine demand that the independent movement places on the internal resources that the social inputs were providing externally. The development of the internal resources, the self-regulation, the self-orientation, the internal meaning-making, and the self-generated emotional stability is the specific development that the movement alone provides that the waiting for others never could. The discomfort of the solitude is the specific condition of the building of those resources. It does not become comfortable immediately. It becomes more manageable as the resources develop. And the resources develop through the specific, consistent, repeated experience of the solitude rather than through the escape from it. Chapter 3. The Power of Moving Alone. When you stop waiting, everything starts moving. The specific changes that the decision to move alone produces are not the dramatic and immediate transformation that the phrase "everything starts moving" might suggest. They are the specific, gradual, accumulative changes in the quality of the decision-making, the quality of the self-knowledge, the quality of the relationship to uncertainty, and the quality of the relationship to the self that the independent movement generates as its consistent outputs. The movement produces these changes not through a single decisive break from the waiting pattern, but through the repeated experience of acting without the prior confirmation, choosing without the prior validation, and enduring without the prior assurance that generates the specific evidence base that the independent person's self-concept is built from. Freedom of independence is the first specific power of the movement alone, and it is the power that most consistently surprises the person who has recently moved from the waiting pattern to the independent one. The waiting pattern has a specific quality that is easy to mistake for safety, but is actually a very particular form of constraint. The person who is waiting for others to determine the conditions under which the movement will be made is, in a specific and literal sense, having their life's direction determined by whoever's arrival they are waiting for. The movement alone removes this constraint. The direction is determined by the internal assessment rather than the external availability. The pace is determined by the internal readiness rather than the external coordination. The decisions are made by the internal evaluation rather than the external consensus. Clarity without noise is the second specific power. The noise that other people introduce into the decision-making process is not always the noise of conflict or contradiction. It is frequently the well-intentioned noise of the concerned parent, the cautious friend, the risk-averse partner whose presence in the decision process is the presence of the additional anxiety, the additional uncertainty, and the additional consideration that each genuinely cares about person adds to every direction you consider. The independent movement strips this noise away. The direction that you assess alone, without the addition of everyone else's concerns, fears, and preferences, is the direction that you assess with the clearest possible picture of your own genuine values, your own genuine assessment of the risk, and your own genuine judgment of what the forward movement requires. The clarity does not mean the absence of uncertainty. The independent assessment is not more certain than the group assessment. It is more accurate to the specific situation, your values, your genuine assessment than the group assessment, which is the aggregate of multiple people's situations, values, and assessments applied to your life. The clarity is the clarity of the accurate picture rather than the clarity of the resolved uncertainty. And the accurate picture, even with its unresolved uncertainties, is a better foundation for the movement than the group assessment applied to a situation that the group does not fully understand. Faster decisions are the third specific power of the independent movement, and they are the power that produces the most immediate and most visible change in the experience of the person who has moved from the waiting pattern to the independent one. The waiting pattern introduces the specific delay of the coordination, the time required to find, consult, persuade, and reach the consensus of the people whose input the waiting person has made necessary before the decision can be made. The independent decision removes this delay entirely. The assessment is made, the direction is chosen, and the movement begins on the timeline that the genuine requirements of the situation warrant rather than the timeline that the coordination process allows. Self-trust is the fourth specific power, and it is the most significant in the long term because it is the foundation on which the other powers are sustained. Self-trust is not the arrogant belief that your judgment is infallible or that your decisions are always correct. It is the specific confidence that you can assess the situation, make the decision, act on the assessment, and manage whatever the action produces without requiring the prior confirmation that the waiting pattern made necessary. The self-trust is built through the specific experience of doing these things and finding that the outcomes, however imperfect, were manageable and that the management of them produced the specific competence that the prior assessment could not have guaranteed. Why solitude builds strength is the final specific power, and it is the one that addresses the most common misconception about the independent movement. The misconception is that solitude is the absence of the things that build strength, the absence of challenge, the absence of feedback, the absence of the friction that the social environment provides and that the development of character requires. The reality is precisely the opposite. Solitude is the specific condition in which the internal resources are most directly engaged, where the absence of the external support makes the internal support necessary, where the absence of external orientation makes the internal assessment necessary, where the absence of external regulation makes the internal regulation necessary. Each of these necessities is a demand on the internal resources. Each demand is a development opportunity, and the development that solitude produces in the internal resources is the specific development that the presence of the social support, however valuable in other contexts, actively prevents. Chapter 4. Learning to trust yourself. If you do not trust yourself, you will always wait for others. The relationship between self-trust and the waiting pattern is the most direct and most consequential relationship in this audiobook. The person who does not trust their own assessment, their own judgment, and their own capacity to manage the outcomes of their decisions is the person for whom the waiting is the most rational available response to the forward movement. The waiting is the management of the untrust, the substitution of the external judgment for the internal one that is not trusted. And the untrust is self-perpetuating. The waiting that the untrust produces prevents the accumulation of the specific experiences that would build the trust. Self-doubt is the first specific mechanism through which the lack of self-trust produces the waiting pattern. And it is the mechanism that most directly targets the decision-making process. Self-doubt is not the honest recognition of genuine uncertainty. Genuine uncertainty about the outcomes of decisions is the accurate perception of the actual situation. and the person who acknowledges it is being truthful rather than weak. Self-doubt, in the specific sense that produces the waiting pattern, is the systematic undervaluation of your own judgment relative to the judgment of others whose opinions you have made the standard against which your own is evaluated. The systematic undervaluation has a specific dynamic. The other person's opinion is assessed before your own, weighted more heavily than your own, and used as the standard against which your own is evaluated. This dynamic is the specific inversion of the relationship between the internal and the external assessment that the self-trusting person maintains. The self-trusting person assesses internally first, consults externally for the specific information or perspective they do not have access to internally, and then integrates the external input with the weighted authority of useful additional information rather than the overriding authority of the superior judgment. Building the internal first assessment practice is the specific response to the self-doubt pattern. The practice is exactly what the name suggests before seeking the external opinion. Conducting the full internal assessment, the honest evaluation of the available information, the honest identification of the values and priorities that the decision touches, the honest assessment of the risks and the capacity to manage them. This internal assessment is not the performance of thoroughness before the external consultation that will override it. It is the genuine commitment to the internal judgment as the primary source of the direction, with the external consultation serving the specific informational role of filling in the specific gaps that the internal assessment has honestly identified. Overthinking decisions is the second mechanism, and it is the mechanism that most directly produces the experience of the stuck feeling in real time. The overthinking is the specific pattern in which the repeated consideration of the same information from the same perspective produces the increasing paralysis rather than the increasing clarity. The information has been considered, the direction has been assessed. The decision has been approached but not made because the making of the decision requires the commitment that the self-doubt is preventing by continuing to generate the additional consideration that delays the commitment. The specific practice for the overthinking pattern is the decision threshold, the explicit, prior commitment to the level of certainty that is sufficient for the decision, rather than the implicit requirement of the complete certainty that the overthinking is attempting to achieve before the commitment is made. The decision threshold is the specific internal agreement when the assessment has reached this level of confidence. The decision is made and the action is taken. The threshold is not the certainty that the overthinking is pursuing. It is the honest, realistic level of confidence that the available information supports and that the self-trusting person recognizes as sufficient for the movement to begin. Fear of making mistakes is the third mechanism, and it is the one that most directly reveals the specific way the self-trust deficit operates as a system. The fear of making mistakes is the specific fear that the mistake will provide the confirming evidence of the self-doubt, the proof that the internal judgment was not trustworthy, that the direction that was chosen was wrong, that the person who chose it without the prior confirmation of external support was genuinely incapable of the sound judgment they were attempting to exercise. The fear of the mistake is the fear of the self-indictment. The reframing of the mistake that the self-trusting person maintains is the specific antidote to this fear. The mistake is not the evidence of the judgment's fundamental inadequacy. It is the specific outcome of a specific decision made with the specific information available at the time of the decision. which has produced the specific additional information about what works and what does not that could not have been obtained any other way. The mistake is the most efficient form of the learning that the genuine forward movement requires, more efficient than the prior planning that attempts to prevent it, more efficient than the consultation that attempts to outsource it, and available only through the specific decision to act and then assess the outcome rather than to defer the action until all possible mistakes have been theoretically eliminated. Acting without approval is the final practice in the learning of self-trust, and it is the practice that most directly interrupts the waiting pattern at the point of the action. The approval seeking before action is the specific behavior of the person who has not yet developed the self-trust sufficient to take the direction of their own assessment as the authorization for the movement. The approval, when it arrives, does not add to the quality of the assessment. It adds to the emotional comfort of the movement, the reduction of the anxiety about the direction through the external confirmation that the direction is acceptable to someone whose judgment you have placed above your own. Building the capacity to act without the approval is the specific practice of beginning the movement before the approval has been received. Not as the rebellious rejection of others' input. Others' input has genuine value and is genuinely useful in its proper role. As the specific training of the internal authorization, the building of the experience base that accumulates into the self-knowledge that your assessment of the direction, your judgment of the risk, and your capacity to manage the outcomes are sufficient to authorize the action without the prior confirmation of those who have not made that assessment, taken that risk, or made themselves responsible for those outcomes. Chapter 5. Discipline without motivation. You will not always feel ready, you move anyway. The distinction between discipline and motivation is the most practically important distinction in the context of the independent movement, because the independent movement by definition occurs in the conditions of the reduced external support that motivation frequently depends on. Motivation is the specific emotional state of the alignment between the current internal experience and the action that the internal experience is pressing toward, the feeling of energy, enthusiasm, and urgency toward the specific direction that makes the movement feel natural and self-sustaining. Discipline is the specific behavioral commitment that operates regardless of the current emotional state, the action that is taken because the direction was committed to and the commitment is honored, not because the feeling of motivation is currently present. Why motivation is unreliable is the specific understanding that the development of the discipline requires. Motivation is unreliable not because it is rare or because the person who lacks it is deficient in some fundamental quality. It is unreliable because it is a function of the emotional state, and the emotional state is specifically unreliable in the conditions where the independent movement most requires the action. The independent movement is most demanding in the specific conditions of the reduced external support, the reduced external validation, the reduced external encouragement, and the accumulated fatigue of the sustained effort without the social energy that the presence of others provides. These are precisely the conditions in which the emotional state is most depleted and the motivation most absent. Building discipline begins with the specific understanding of what discipline is not. Discipline is not the heroic forcing of the action through the overwhelming opposition of the absence of motivation. The person who experiences the discipline primarily as the forceful override of the motivation deficit is experiencing a version of the discipline that will not sustain across the duration that the genuinely significant independent movement requires. The sustainable discipline is the specific behavioral habit that has been practiced sufficiently that it no longer requires the active override that has been repeated so consistently that the doing of it is the natural expression of the established pattern rather than the effortful management of the motivation gap. The building of the sustainable discipline follows the same logic as the building of all behavioral habits, the consistent application of the specific behavior across a sufficient range of the conditions that would previously have produced the avoidance, until the consistent application has built the neural infrastructure that makes the behavior the more practiced and therefore more natural response to the triggering condition than the avoidance was. The first day of the discipline practice is the most effortful. The second day is slightly less so. The 10th day less again. The 50th day is the specific experience of the habit that is beginning to express itself as the natural response rather than the overridden one. Action over feeling is the specific behavioral principle of the discipline practice, the consistent prioritization of the committed action over the current emotional assessment of whether the action feels warranted, productive, or motivated. The feeling is real and should not be dismissed. The feeling is not, however, the accurate assessment of the action's value or the appropriate criterion for whether the action should be taken. The feeling is the current emotional state's assessment of the action, which is a function of the current emotional state rather than of the action's genuine merit. The discipline practice is the specific behavioral expression of the understanding that the action's merit was established when the direction was committed to, in the clearer-headed state before the immediate emotional assessment of the specific moment, and that the current emotional state's assessment does not revise the earlier commitment. Consistency in solitude is the specific form of the discipline that the independent movement requires, and it is the form that is most directly built through the specific practice of the action in the absence of the external support. The consistency is the most demanding in the conditions of the solitude because the solitude removes the specific social motivators, the accountability to others, the encouragement of others, the competitive energy of others' presence that frequently provide the external dimension of the motivation that sustains the consistency. The consistent action in the solitude is the specific proof to the self that the consistency was genuinely internal, that it was the expression of the developed discipline rather than the response to the social environment's facilitation of it. Showing up for yourself is the final specific practice of the discipline chapter, and it is the one that most directly builds the self-trust described in the preceding chapter. The showing up for yourself is the specific, consistent, repeated behavior of doing the thing you committed to doing in the time you committed to doing it, in the conditions you committed to doing it in, regardless of the emotional state that the specific moment produces, and regardless of the external support or encouragement that the specific moment provides. Each instance of the showing up is the specific proof, accumulated gradually across many instances, that you are the person who can be relied upon to do the thing you committed to doing. Not by others, by yourself. The reliability to yourself is the specific foundation of the self-trust that the waiting pattern prevents and that the independent movement builds. Chapter 6. Facing loneliness without escaping it. Loneliness is not your enemy. Avoiding it is. The distinction between loneliness and solitude is the foundational distinction of this chapter, and it requires the precision that popular usage frequently blurs. Solitude is the specific condition of the physical or social absence of others, the state of being alone with the self, without the immediate presence of the social environment. Loneliness is the specific emotional experience of the desire for connection in the presence of its perceived absence. The two frequently occur together but are not identical, and the distinction between them matters enormously for the specific practice that this chapter develops. The person who experiences the solitude of the independent movement is in the condition of the social absence. They may or may not be in the emotional state of the loneliness, the desire for connection that the absence produces. The specific development that this chapter addresses is the capacity to be in the condition of the solitude, to engage with the emotional experience of the loneliness that the solitude produces without the specific behavioral pattern of the escape that the discomfort of the loneliness naturally generates. Sitting with discomfort is the first specific practice, and it is the practice that most directly contradicts the specific behavioral pattern that the loneliness discomfort produces. The discomfort of the loneliness generates the pressure toward the escape, the reach for the phone, the unnecessary social engagement, the distraction that reduces the intensity of the loneliness feeling without addressing the internal capacity that the loneliness is demanding the development of. The escape relieves the discomfort temporarily. It prevents the development of the specific capacity, the internal self-sufficiency that the sustained engagement with the discomfort would have built. The practice of sitting with the discomfort is not the masochistic insistence on suffering for its own sake. It is the specific, deliberate, repeated experience of allowing the loneliness feeling to be present without the immediate behavioral response designed to eliminate it, the specific training of the internal system to experience the discomfort of the solitude without the emergency response of the escape. The training reduces the intensity of the discomfort over time, not by eliminating the loneliness, but by building the internal resources that make the loneliness a manageable experience rather than the threatening emergency that the untrained system experiences it as. Emotional strength in the context of loneliness is the specific development of the capacity to be moved by the genuine human experience of the desire for connection without being driven by it. The emotionally strong person is not the person who does not feel lonely. The loneliness is the genuine human experience of the genuine human need for connection, and the absence of the feeling would not be strength. The emotionally strong person is the person whose loneliness feeling is the experience of a genuine need that is being honestly acknowledged, rather than the emergency that is driving the immediate behavioral response to eliminate the discomfort. The development of this emotional strength follows the same mechanism as all the development described in this audiobook, the repeated experience of the feeling alongside the maintained forward movement, rather than the escape from the feeling that prevents both the feeling and the forward movement. The person who has repeatedly experienced the loneliness of the independent movement and has continued to move while it was present has not waited for it to resolve before continuing, has built the specific self-knowledge that the loneliness is survivable, that it does not prevent the movement, and that it does not indicate the fundamental inadequacy of the chosen direction. That self-knowledge is the emotional strength. Growth in isolation is the specific outcome of the sustained engagement with the loneliness rather than the escape from it. The isolation that is engaged with rather than escaped from provides the specific conditions in which the internal resources are most directly developed. The self-orientation that is built when the external orientation is not available. The self-generated meaning that is built when the external provision of meaning is not present. The self-regulation that is built when the external regulation of the social environment is not providing the emotional management that it otherwise supplies. These internal resources are the specific development that the independent movement in the solitude produces, the development that the escape from the loneliness consistently prevents. Not running back to distractions is the final practice of this chapter and the specific behavioral expression of all that precedes it. The distraction is the specific alternative to the sustained engagement with the loneliness, the activity that reduces the intensity of the loneliness feeling without building the internal capacity that the sustained engagement would produce. The distractions are not inherently problematic. The phone, the social media, the unnecessary social engagement all have their legitimate roles in the full human life. They become the problem in the specific pattern of the escape when they are reached for specifically because the loneliness has become uncomfortable and the discomfort needs to be managed rather than engaged with. The recognition of this pattern, the specific awareness of the moment when the distraction is being sought as the escape rather than the genuine engagement, is the first practice of the not running. The second is the specific decision, in that moment, to remain with the discomfort a little longer before the reach for the relief. Chapter 7. Building Yourself in Silence. The strongest transformations happen when no one is watching. The specific paradox of the development that this chapter addresses is the way that the most significant building of the self occurs in the conditions that are least visible to others. The visible development, the achievement that is witnessed, the growth that is acknowledged, the progress that receives the social confirmation of the respect and the recognition of the people around you is real and genuinely valuable. But the visible development is built on the foundation of the invisible development, and the invisible development occurs specifically in the conditions of the silence when no one is watching, when no one is confirming, when no one is providing the external signal that what is being built has value. Invisible growth is the specific process through which the most durable qualities of the character are developed: the self-trust, the discipline, the self-orientation, the internal standard, and the specific pattern of the decision-making that the independent movement requires. These qualities are not developed through the visible achievement. They are developed through the invisible practice, the specific, repeated, unwitnessed experience of making the difficult decision without the prior confirmation, taking the uncomfortable action without the prior encouragement, enduring the difficulty of the independent movement without the prior assurance of the external recognition. The specific quality of the invisible growth that distinguishes it from the visible achievement is the specific relationship it creates between the person and the evidence of their own development. The visible achievement creates the relationship between the person and the external confirmation. The achievement is evidence of the development in the minds of the people who witnessed it, which produces the external confirmation that the development occurred. The invisible growth creates the relationship between the person and the internal evidence. The growth is evidence of the development in the person's own experience, which produces the internal knowledge that the development occurred regardless of whether anyone else witnessed it. The internal knowledge is the more durable foundation of the confidence that the independent movement requires, because it does not depend on the continued presence of the witnesses for its maintenance. The confidence built on the visible achievement requires the continued achievement to maintain the external confirmation that the confidence is based on. The confidence built on the invisible growth is maintained by the specific self-knowledge that the growth occurred, the knowledge that does not require the external confirmation because the growth was directly experienced rather than externally confirmed. Daily self-improvement in silence is the specific practice that builds the invisible growth into the durable foundation described above. The daily practice is not the dramatic gesture of the commitment to the significant change. It is the specific, consistent, unremarkable application of the direction in the ordinary conditions of the ordinary day, the reading that was done before the day's demands began. The specific practice that was maintained despite the absence of the external accountability. The direction that was held in the absence of the external encouragement. Each of these is tiny in isolation. The accumulation of many tiny practices is the specific material from which the significant development is built. Small wins in the context of the invisible growth are the specific intermediate markers of the development, the evidence available only to the person who is building in the silence, that the direction is being maintained and the progress is being made. The small one is not the dramatic achievement. It is the specific instance of the doing of the thing that the direction required, in the conditions that would previously have produced the avoidance, that did not produce the avoidance. Each small one is the specific proof that the pattern is changing, that the person who was not able to make this specific action in these specific conditions is developing the capacity that makes it possible. No validation needed is the specific identity marker of the person who is built sufficiently in the silence to have the internal evidence of the development as the primary reference for the self-connect rather than the external confirmation. The development of this specific quality, the specific shift from the external to the internal as the primary reference, is the most significant development that the building in silence produces. It is the specific condition in which the independent movement becomes genuinely sustainable rather than the effortful management of the absence of the external validation that the dependent person experiences as the specific cost of the independence. Internal progress, the specific experience of the development that is available only to the person who is making it, is the ultimate reference for the person who has built themselves in silence, not the impressive achievement, not the recognized transformation. The specific, honest, internal knowledge that the person who is making the movement today is genuinely more capable, more self-trusting, more disciplined, and more internally directed than the person who was waiting 6 months ago. That knowledge, available only to the person who built it, is the specific most valuable product of the building in silence. Chapter 8. Stop explaining yourself to others. Not everyone needs to understand your path. The explaining pattern is the specific behavioral expression of the approval seeking that Chapter 4 addressed in the context of the waiting for approval pattern. The explanation is the verbal attempt to manage the gap between what you are doing and what the people around you understand or approve of. It is the specific effort to generate the understanding that would produce the approval that the independent movement does not wait for, but that the habit of the approval seeking continues to seek through the explanation. The explaining has a specific cost that is not immediately visible in the individual instance, but accumulates significantly across the pattern of the many instances. Each explanation is the investment of the attentional and emotional resource in the management of others' understanding of your direction, the resource that the independent movement requires for the direction itself. And each explanation carries the implicit message to both the explainer and the recipient that the explainer's direction requires the understanding of others to be legitimate. The direction that requires no explanation carries the implicit message that its legitimacy does not depend on others' understanding of it. Letting go of approval is the first specific practice of the Stop Explaining chapter. The specific, deliberate, repeated experience of allowing others' lack of understanding of your direction to be present without the behavioral response of the explanation that would manage it. The lack of understanding is real. The direction you are moving in, particularly in the early stages of the independent movement when the direction is genuinely new and the evidence of its validity is not yet visible, is frequently not understood by the people around you. Their lack of understanding is not the evidence that the direction is wrong. It is the evidence that the direction is yours, specific to your development, your values, and your genuine assessment of what the forward movement requires in ways that may not be immediately legible to people whose own development and values are genuinely different. People misunderstanding you is the specific experience that the letting go of approval practice is built for. The person who has developed the specific skill of acting without the approval is still affected by the experience of being misunderstood. The genuine human desire for connection includes the desire to be understood, and the absence of understanding is genuinely uncomfortable. The skill is not the elimination of the discomfort. It is the specific capacity to continue moving in the direction of the genuine internal assessment while the discomfort of the misunderstanding is present without the behavioral response of the explanation that would manage the discomfort at the cost of the attentional resource and the implicit concession that the direction requires the understanding to proceed. Staying focused in the context of the Stop Explaining practice is the specific behavioral expression of the attentional governance, the maintained direction of the cognitive and behavioral resource toward the genuine requirements of the independent movement rather than the management of others' response to it. The focus is not the indifference to others. It is the specific allocation of the limited attentional resource to the things that the internal assessment has identified as genuinely important, rather than the reactive allocation of the resource to whatever others' responses to the direction make emotionally salient. Protecting your energy is the specific practical dimension of the Stop Explaining practice. The explanation is an energy expenditure. The energy that is spent on the explanation is energy that is not available for the direction. In the specific conditions of the independent movement where the energy is required for the internal management of the motivation deficit, the loneliness, the self-doubt, and the accumulated difficulty of the consistent action without the external support, the conservation of the energy for the direction rather than the management of others' understanding of it is the specific practical expression of the self-sufficiency that this audiobook builds. Moving without noise is the final specific practice of this chapter, the specific quality of the independent movement that most directly expresses the let go of approval development. The noisy movement is the movement that is accompanied by the announcement, the explanation, the seeking of the understanding and the being of the people and the surrounding environment before and during the action. The quiet movement is the movement that is accompanied by the action itself, the doing of the thing that the direction requires, in the conditions that the genuine timing warrants, without the prior management of others' understanding that the noisy movement requires before it begins. The quiet movement is more efficient, more honest to the internal direction, and more directly expressive of the self-trust that the independent movement is built from. It is also, in the experience of most people who have developed it through the deliberate practice of the stop explaining, more respected by the people around them than the noisy movement, for the specific reason that the quiet movement communicates the specific quality of the non-neediness that the respite-generating presence this audiobook describes in Chapter 11. Chapter 9. Becoming self-sufficient. When you rely on yourself, you stop being dependent. Self-sufficiency is the specific developed quality of the person whose functioning does not require the prior provision of external resources, emotional, directional, or motivational, before it can begin. The self-sufficient person is not the person who never benefits from external resources. The external resources, the connection with others, the input of the people whose perspective and experience genuinely adds to the quality of the assessment, the shared effort of the collaboration that genuinely multiplies the individual capacity, are genuinely valuable, and the self-sufficient person uses them when they are genuinely available and genuinely useful. The self-sufficiency is the specific quality of the functioning that continues when the external resources are not available, without the degradation of the quality or the cessation of the movement that the dependent person experiences in the same absence. Emotional independence is the first specific dimension of the self-sufficiency. Emotional independence is the specific capacity of the internal emotional regulation, the maintenance of the functional emotional state through the internally generated resources rather than the externally provided ones. The emotionally dependent person requires the presence of others to maintain the regulated emotional state, the reassurance to manage the anxiety, the encouragement to manage the discouragement, the company to manage the loneliness. Each of these is a form of the external provision of the regulation that the emotionally independent person has developed the internal capacity to provide. The development of the emotional independence does not require the repudiation of the genuine value of the emotional support that others provide. It requires the specific development of the internal capacity to manage the emotional states that the independent movement produces through the practices described in the preceding chapters, so that the external support is the valuable addition to the sufficient internal capacity rather than the required substitute for the absent one. The person who has developed the emotional independence can genuinely receive and benefit from the emotional support of others without being dependent on it for the maintenance of the forward movement. Decision independence is the second specific dimension, the capacity to assess the available information, identify the genuine values and priorities that the decision touches, evaluate the options, and commit to the direction without the prior provision of the external consensus that confirms the direction. The decision-independent person is not the person who never consults others. The consultation of the people whose experience or perspective genuinely adds to the quality of the assessment is the intelligent use of the available resources. The decision independence is the specific capacity to complete the decision process when the external consultation is not available, and to hold the direction when the external consensus is not provided. Stability as the specific quality of the self-sufficient person is the behavioral expression of both the emotional independence and the decision independence, the maintained quality of the functioning across the varying conditions of the available external support. The stable person functions well when the external support is present and continues to function well when it is not. The stability is not the absence of the preference for the external support. It is the specific quality of the functioning that continues in the absence of the preference's fulfillment. Confidence without support is the specific dimension of the self-sufficiency that most directly produces the social quality described in Chapter 11, the respect that others extend to the person who demonstrates the non-neediness that genuine self-sufficiency produces. The confidence without support is not the performance of the confidence that is felt. It is the genuine quality of the person whose self-assessment is maintained by the internal evidence of the development rather than the external confirmation of others' recognition. The genuineness of the confidence is what the social intelligence of others reads as the specific quality of the authority that does not require the external validation for its maintenance. Internal strength is the comprehensive quality that the self-sufficiency produces, the specific integration of the emotional independence, the decision independence, the stability, and the confidence without support into the single quality of the person who is genuinely capable of the full functioning of the self-directed life. The internal strength is not the dramatic performance of the invulnerability. It is the quiet, consistent, demonstrated quality of the person who continues to assess, to decide, to act, and to manage the outcomes of the action across the full range of the conditions that the independent movement produces, including the conditions of the loneliness, the self-doubt, the absence of the support, and the discomfort of the misunderstanding without the cessation of the forward movement that those conditions produce in the person who has not developed the internal strength. Chapter 10. Mastering yourself before the world. You do not need more people. You need more control over yourself. The mastery of the self is the specific prerequisite for the genuine effectiveness in the world, the development that makes the external achievement the accurate expression of the internal quality rather than the compensatory performance of the quality that the internal development has not yet produced. Most people attempt the opposite sequence. They seek the external achievement as the proof of the internal quality before the internal quality has been genuinely developed. The external achievement is pursued as the substitute for the internal mastery rather than as the expression of it. The substitute does not hold. The achievement that is not built on the genuine internal mastery is the achievement that requires the continuous performance of the quality that the achievement is supposed to demonstrate, because the quality was not actually present, only the performance of it. Self-control in the context of the mastery of the self is the specific capacity to govern the behavioral output and the conditions that are most pressing against the governed behavior, the conditions of the frustration, the discouragement, the conflict, the temptation, and the accumulated difficulty of the sustained independent movement. The self-control is not the suppression of the experience of these conditions. It is the maintained quality of the behavioral output despite the experience of them. The person who maintains the governed behavior in the conditions that produce the strongest pressure toward the ungoverned behavior is the person who is genuinely developing the self-mastery. Emotional discipline is the second dimension of the self-mastery, the specific capacity described throughout this audiobook to experience the full range of the emotional life while maintaining the behavioral quality that the internal standards require. The emotionally disciplined person is not the person who does not feel the loneliness, the self-doubt, the discouragement, and the frustration of the independent movement. They feel it completely. The discipline is the maintained quality of the behavior alongside the feeling, the continued movement in the genuinely chosen direction, while the emotional experience of the difficulty of the movement is fully present. Clear thinking under the conditions that most press against the clear thinking is the third dimension of the self-mastery, the maintained quality of the deliberate, honest, evidence-based assessment in the conditions of the emotional activation that most consistently distort it. The clear thinking in the comfortable conditions is not the mastery. The clear thinking in the conditions of the genuine pressure, the frustration, the fear, the urgency, the desire to have the discomfort resolved through the immediate action that the clear thinking would not have produced is the specific expression of the developed self-mastery. Personal standards are the specific behavioral expressions of the self-mastery, the explicit prior commitments to the quality of the behavior that the self-mastering person maintains in the conditions that press against the maintenance. The standard is the specific declaration made in the clarity of the deliberate commitment rather than the reactivity of the immediate condition, of the minimum quality of behavior that the genuine self-respect requires. Each instance of the maintained standard in the conditions that press against it is the specific evidence of the self-mastery in practice. The identity shift from the externally directed person to the self-mastering one is the cumulative product of many specific instances of the maintained standard, the maintained discipline, the maintained clear thinking, and the maintained self-governance across the conditions that press against each. The shift is not the dramatic transformation of the single committed decision to be different. It is the gradual, accumulated, evidence-based development of the self-concept that accurately reflects the genuinely developed qualities, the self-concept of the person who genuinely does these things rather than the aspiration of the person who wishes to. Chapter 11. Why people respect those who move alone. People respect what they cannot influence. The specific mechanism through which the independent movement generates the respect of others is the mechanism of the non-neediness, the specific quality of the person whose direction, behavior, and self-assessment do not require the input, the approval, or the presence of others for their maintenance. The non-neediness generates the respect because the social intelligence system that assesses the people in the social environment is specifically calibrated to distinguish the person who is governed from the inside from the person who is governed from the outside. Independence's strength is the specific social assessment that the non-neediness generates. The person who does not require the validation, the support, or the approval of others before making the movement is communicating something very specific to the social environment that the assessment of the direction, the confidence in the judgment, and the capacity to manage the outcomes of the action are all sufficient without the external provision. This communication is the specific content of the social assessment of independence, a strength, not the dramatic performance of the invulnerability, but the consistent, behavioral demonstration of the self-sufficiency that the independent movement produces. Silent confidence is the specific quality of the presence that the person who moves alone develops, the specific presence of the person whose confidence is not communicated through the assertion of the confident position, but through the behavioral consistency of the self-directed action across the conditions that would produce the hesitation. The waiting, or the seeking of the confirmation in the person who lacks the genuine confidence. The silence of the confidence is not the absence of the confidence. It is the specific expression of the confidence that is internally maintained rather than externally asserted, the confidence that does not need to announce itself because it is demonstrated through the quality of the behavior. Non-neediness as the specific quality of the respected presence is the quality that the social intelligence system most consistently registers and most durably responds to. The needy person, the person whose direction, behavior, and self-assessment require the input of others for their maintenance, is the person whom the social environment reads as available to be moved by the withdrawal or the provision of the specific input that the needy person requires. The person who is available to be moved by the withdrawal of what they need is the person whose direction can be influenced by whoever controls the supply of what they need. The non-needy person is not available to be moved in this way. Their direction is maintained by the internal assessment rather than the external provision. And the people who might attempt to influence the direction through the management of the external provision find the lever unavailable. Presence as the specific quality of the person who moves alone is the presence described in the psychological authority chapter of several earlier audiobooks in this series, the specific quality of being fully there, fully attending, and fully engaged with what is actually present rather than the divided presence of the person whose attention is split between the external situation and the internal management of the anxiety about the external confirmation. The person who moves alone has developed the specific internal management that makes the full presence available, the self-regulation, the self-orientation, the internal emotional management that keeps the attention available for the genuine engagement with what is actually there rather than the management of the anxiety about the external confirmation. Respect through behavior is the final and most important dimension of this chapter, the specific mechanism through which the respect is generated that the dependent person is waiting for without being able to produce. The dependent person is typically attempting to generate the respect through the assertion of the qualities that would produce it, the performance of the confidence, the claim to the independence, the stated direction without the behavioral demonstration of the direction. The respected person generates the respect through the behavioral demonstration of the qualities, the consistent, condition-independent, quiet expression of the self-direction, the self-trust, the emotional discipline, and the self-mastery that the independent movement produces. The behavior is the proof is what generates the respect, and the proof is only available through the movement itself. Chapter 12. When the right people finally appear. When you stop chasing, the right people come naturally. The final chapter of this audiobook addresses the specific development that completes the transformation from the waiting-dependent person to the self-moving one, the specific quality of the relationship to others that the developed self-sufficiency produces. This chapter is not the reward that follows the independence, the arrival of the right people as the consolation prize for having survived the difficulty of the independent movement. It is the specific description of how the quality of the connection with others genuinely changes when the connection is no longer the requirement for the forward movement, but the valued addition to the already sufficient internal capacity. Attraction versus pursuit is the specific dynamic that changes most dramatically when the self-sufficiency is genuinely developed. The pursuing person is the person whose connection with others is motivated by the need for what the others provide: the validation, the support, the reassurance, the company that manages the loneliness. The pursuit is the behavioral expression of the need, and the people who are pursued in this dynamic are being pursued because of what they supply rather than because of who they are. The quality of the connection that the pursuit produces is the quality of the supply and demand relationship rather than the quality of the genuine choosing the connection that is there because the supply was available rather than because the choosing was genuine. The attraction dynamic, the specific quality of the connection that develops when the connection is the genuine choice of two people who do not require each other for their functioning, is a qualitatively different relationship. The person who has developed the self-sufficiency is not pursuing the connection for the supply of what they need. They are choosing the connection for the genuine quality of what the other person contributes to a life that is already functioning at the adequate level without the contribution. The choice is the genuine evaluation: who is this person? What is the genuine quality of the connection? What does this relationship add to the life that the independent movement has built rather than the pursuit of the supply that the need makes necessary regardless of the quality of the supplier? Quality over quantity is the specific shift in the relationship to others that the self-sufficiency produces. The dependent person requires the quantity of the support because each provider has a limited capacity, and the need exceeds what any one provider can supply. The self-sufficient person requires the quality of the connection, the genuine alignment of the values, the genuine mutual respect, the genuine contribution to the life that the independent movement has built rather than the quantity of the provision of the supply of the need. The shift from the quantity to the quality is the specific expression of the self-sufficiency in the domain of the relationship to others. Healthy connections are the specific quality of the relationships that the self-sufficient person builds, the connections that are characterized by the mutual choosing rather than the mutual needing, the genuine contributing rather than the supply and demand provision, and the specific quality of the respect that the independent movement generates in others and that the self-sufficient person extends to others on the basis of the same quality. The healthy connection is the connection between two people who are each sufficient to themselves and who choose the connection because the mutual contribution genuinely adds value to the life that each has built independently. The connection does not complete either person. It enriches a life that is already complete. Not needing others to feel complete is the specific quality of the self that the developed self-sufficiency produces, and it is the quality that most consistently produces the paradox that this chapter describes. The person who does not need others attracts others more consistently and more genuinely than the person who does. The paradox resolves when the mechanism is understood. The person who needs others is seeking from others the provision of the specific supply that the internal insufficiency requires. The social intelligence of others registers this seeking and responds with the specific wariness that the neediness generates the sense that the connection is being sought for what the seeker needs rather than for who the other person is. The person who does not need others is seeking nothing, or more precisely, is genuinely choosing rather than needing. A social intelligence of others registers this choosing and responds with the specific quality of the genuine interest that the non-neediness generates. Choosing instead of needing is the final specific expression of everything this audiobook has built, the specific quality of the relationship to others that the full development of the self-sufficiency produces. The person who chooses the connection rather than needing the supply is the person who has completed the specific transformation from the dependent to the independent that this audiobook describes. Not the transformation to the isolated. The isolation is not the goal, and the complete absence of genuine connection is not the expression of the developed independence. The transformation to the genuinely choosing the person whose connections are the expressions of the genuine values, the genuine appreciation of the specific quality of the specific person, and the genuine contribution to a life that is already moving and already building and already sufficiently self-directed to make the connection the valued addition rather than the required rescue. The right people appear when you stop waiting for them and start building the life that genuinely attracts the quality of the connection you actually want, not through the performance of the independence. Through the genuine development of it, through the specific practices described in the 12 chapters of this audiobook, through the actual building of the self-sufficient, self-trusting, self-directed, disciplined, and internally strong person that the independent movement, sustained across the duration that the genuine development requires, produces. Closing. The movement begins now. You were never stuck. This is the specific truth that this audiobook has been building toward from the first chapter. The experience of being stuck, the specific, genuine, painful experience of the person who is not moving, who is not building, who is not getting closer to the life that the forward movement would produce is not the accurate perception of a genuine incapacity. It is the accurate perception of the waiting pattern. The waiting that has been mistaken for patience. The caporal seeking that has been mistaken for prudence. The avoidance of the solitude that has been mistaken for the legitimate preference for connection. The absence of the self-trust that has been mistaken for the appropriate recognition of the genuine limits of the individual judgment. You were not stuck. You were waiting. Waiting for people who were never going to arrive in the form you were waiting for. Waiting for the support that would finally make the forward movement feel safe enough. Waiting for the validation that would confirm the direction was right. Waiting for the approval that would make the action feel authorized. Waiting for the conditions that would reduce the risk of the movement to the level that the absence of the self-trust required before the movement could begin. The 12 chapters of this audiobook have developed the specific practices that interrupt the waiting at each of its specific mechanisms. The understanding of why the waiting pattern is maintained and what it costs. The specific recognition of the fear, the social conditioning, and the need for reassurance that produce the stuck feeling. The specific development of the self-trust that replaces the external validation as the authorization for the action. The specific discipline that maintains the movement in the conditions where the motivation is absent. The specific capacity to face the loneliness without the escape that prevents the development. The specific practice of the building in silence that generates the invisible growth that the visible achievement is built from. The specific letting go of the explaining that conserves the energy for the direction. The specific development of the self-sufficiency that makes the functioning independent of the prior provision of the external support. The specific mastery of the self that makes the external achievement the genuine expression of the internal quality. The specific non-neediness that generates the respect that the pursuit never could. And the specific quality of the choosing that the self-sufficient person brings to the connections that the developed independence makes genuinely possible. The moment you stop waiting and start moving alone, everything changes. Not because the conditions improve, not because the people arrive, not because the support materializes, because you change. Because the movement itself, sustained across the conditions of the solitude and the self-doubt and the absence of the external confirmation, builds the specific qualities that the conditions could not have provided and that the waiting was preventing. The strongest version of you is not built with others. It is built within yourself. In the silence, in the discipline, in the accumulated evidence of the many small actions taken without the prior validation, in the self-trust that the many small movements built, in the identity of the person who moves, who has always been capable of moving and who is now moving. Stop waiting. Start moving. Alone. Until you become everything you were waiting for others to see.